Right, knight versus rook when there are more pawns on the board than just one pawn each, and kicking off with all the pawns just on one side of the board. The rook, it goes almost without saying, is a much more mobile piece than the knight. And if there are pawns on both sides of the board, especially if there are pass pawns involved, then the rook's just going to, be clearly superior, and the win's going to be fairly straightforward. Even with the pawns all on one side of the board, if it's like a 3-on-3 or a 2-on-2, the win's still pretty straightforward a lot of the time, and the rook just wins in sort of the overwhelming majority of cases. Um, so this position here, this is a 1954 game. It's white to play. It's a 2-on-2. Um, all black wants to do, all the defending side with the knight wants to do at any given time, is just sort of swap off all the pawns if they can, and get a drawn version of knight versus rook, which is just where their king and knight are together and not stuck in the corner. But it's just not going to be possible, and white can win this fairly easily by just going after the f7 pawn. Zugzwang is the main weapon, or one of the main weapons for the attacking side. So let's just go through the moves here. I mean, the plan is we're going to get our king to e8, where it's going to attack the f7 pawn. It's going to weaken black's position to the point we can then maneuver our king to f6, and black's position just starts to fall apart. So rook b8 is a good opening move, because it just takes away all these squares for the king. Black doesn't really want to move their knight. It's in a nice place. It's controlling a couple of important invasion squares, whilst this pawn controls this one. And they don't really want to move their king either now, because king h7 and the white king's in straight away. So rook b8, and we're sort of forcing the black knight to move. It doesn't particularly matter where it goes, because you'd think it's just coming back to f5 next move. In this 1954 game, knight g3 was played. And then we're going to march off to e8 with our kings, to king d6. Knight f5 check played in the game. If instead knight h5, alright, it controls this square and it attacks f4, which is sort of the dual purpose thing that you're looking for from a knight in these situations. But the white rook can just simply come back and defend the f-pawn. King f8, trying to keep white out. King d7, and if black refuses to move the king to let the white king into the e8 square and does something like knight g3, then we can shove in this check and come into e8 anyway, because this is no longer attacked. So yeah, not knight h5, and instead knight f5 check played in the game, but the white king slowly made its way to e8, like so. Rook d6, pretty important to cover the d6 square. I mean, that just takes away a lot of these squares anyway from the knight, but obviously rook b7 would be a disaster. In fact, that looks like it would be a losing move. So rook d8 covering the d6 square, king g7, rook d7. If that f-pawn falls with check, then white clearly made progress. So king back to g8, hoping for a rook takes f7 blunder, and white just plays a waiting move. So still attacking the f7 pawn. We might see knight g7 check, king e7, knight back to f5 check, and the white king has made progress into f6. There's not really anywhere that black can check that f6 king now, and we have two pieces ganging up on f7. It's falling apart for black. Knight d6, defending the f7 pawn, rook c6, knight e4 check, king e7, king g7, and the way white now finished it off, easy for me to say, I don't think it's necessary. I think there are other ways to go about it, but this was a nice little finish here, rook f6, and black resigned. So if it's 3 pawns on 3 or 2 pawns on 2, even if the pawns are all on the same wing, the side with the rook is usually able to win relatively in a relatively straightforward manner. If the defending side has an extra pawn, then drawing chances increase quite dramatically. So this is a position from 1930. Alekhine was actually black in this game and did win it. Possibly as a result of winning it, claimed in sort of the the reports afterwards that this is just a winning position for black. And in fact, it's not. See, this is a drawn position. What I'm working out that you need to do, or that we need to do in these situations, if you get like a knight versus a rook, very similar to the knight and one pawn versus the rook and one pawn, is that we have to spend time thinking about where we want our pieces. Okay, something that I'm very bad at, though getting very slightly better at, is recognizing when in a game, like the dust has settled from one particular dynamic, which could be this position here. You know, we could have arrived at this position after the dust has settled, after a few exchanges, something was going on before. And now we're sort of in the end game. We have a, if you like, a new position, a blank slate. The only way that black's going to make progress here is to try and get their king into our camp. And that might be possible. You know, if you just glanced at the board, you wouldn't know whether, like, white's had it in this position. You know, a very strong grandmaster of the time did think that white had it in this position. But whether they've had it or not, it's going to take a few moves for black to get their king into the camp. It's going to take a while for that to happen, which means we've got 3, 4, 5, possibly 6 moves. We've definitely got lots of time here, if we think about it now, to work out, right, where do we want our pieces? So like if it's a knight and one pawn versus a rook and one pawn, you think about where you want your, you know, your knight, and the best square is where it controls key invasion squares while simultaneously attacking the opponent's pawn. And it's similar here. Some guy apparently analysed this position 10 years afterwards, and you know, suggested, and there were other suggestions as well, but suggested a very sort of strong defensive configuration, but it was along the same lines. Okay? You want to try and get your knight into a position where it's going to control key invasion squares into your camp, but also attack the enemy pawns. Okay? And one suggestion was to get the pawn to g4. Okay? If the white pawn gets to g4, possibly with this pawn on h5 as well, then white's defensive setup is pretty strong. And it's just about, like, in there is then just about, like, where do we want our knight, where it's going to tie either the black king or the black rook down to the defense of g7. So, yeah, that's what I'm sort of gleaning from all of this, is when the dust has settled from a previous part of the game, you know, because how many times have we just sort of watched games and also been involved in those games ourselves where we sort of get to the end game, if you like, and we don't really know what we're doing, so we just sort of play some moves until our kings meet each other in the middle and then go, right, now what? Now what do we do? So I think what the good players do, what the strong players do, is they'll spend time, they'll recognise when it's a change in dynamic of the position, and they'll spend time thinking about, okay, what do I want here? They can think schematically. Where do I want my pieces? What's the best defensive setup here? Because we've got 3, 4, 5 moves to sort it out. And the best move is king h3. Just shift the king to push that g-pawn. So let's investigate king h3 and just go through some example lines. I don't know, let's say black plays rook a3, stopping us from playing g4 straight away. King into g4, king e6, king to f4, still threatening g4. King d5, I mean, if black plays g6, then there's the g4 move we want straight away. King d5, and here we could actually take advantage of the fact that, you know, because g6 hasn't been played, you can take advantage of that by playing h5, and it's fairly clear that can be supported, that h-pawn's not going to be weak, as it is in the game. That h-pawn's pushed at a point where it can't be defended very easily. King d4, knight to d6, king d3. I mean, the black king's in. How many moves is that? So that's 5 moves after the original position. Knight to f5, again controlling key squares, but also attacking enemy pawn. Rook a4, check, king back to g3, attack the knight, come back and defend the knight. We're happy with a repetition. Black gives up on that and plays rook a7. There's the g4, black king's in, white king pops back to g3 to control this square. And the point is that, all right, our f pawn's weak, but we can always meet an attack on it with knight d4 check. And in fact, in this sort of defensive setup, Dvoretsky writes that, you know, even if the knight was on e6 or g2, the f4 square is such a good square for the knight, because presumably in this situation, if f3 is attacked, we can always pop the knight into f4 with check, which is going to do one of two things. It's either going to put the king in front of the rook's attack on f3, or it's going to move the king away from being in touch with f3. And then we can just put the knight back to where it came from. This is just, I don't know if you'd call it a fortress, but it's just an impenetrable defensive setup. And it's quite a simple one, to be honest. If back in the original position we'd thought about where do we want our pieces, what's a good defensive setup, just go about setting it up, and yeah, it would have just been a draw. Looking at another example line, king h3, let's instead say that black plays king e6, so just sort of bring the king in. Let's just play this g4 move straight away, still coming in with a king, so we come in and stop the black king coming into f4. I mean, if we see king d4, then h5, it's going to be very similar to what we had before, king e3. In fact, it's going to be almost exactly the same, isn't it? I'm sure that's about to transpose knight d6, and that knight's coming to f5. So if back in this position black didn't fancy that and realised that, you know, you're going to play h5 and get your knight to f5, they might think to stop it with g6. Now what do we do? Well, we're sort of running out of a bit of space. That is an annoying pawn push. Knight f2, a couple of lines that get looked at here. One's rook a3, knight h3, rook a4, and you know, I've made out like this is a very easy position to draw, but White's got to be careful here. In fact, White's only got two drawing moves now. They're sort of running out of space. This g6 move was a bit annoying, taking a bit more control, and White's knight's in a sort of awkward place. So if White just sort of not hops their knight somewhere, like knight f2, this is now one for black, because the white pieces are just not coordinated very well. They bring their king in, knight back to h3, king e3, and now we can see that, this is not looking good. Obviously the knight can't come to f4 because it just gets lost. We might see a king move, and black will just use zugzwang, just sort of slowly make you run out of moves. Rook down to a1. If the king goes back to g3, we've got rook f1. That's clearly over. So if white tries to maintain control of the f1 square, I mean, there is nowhere for the knight to go. I wonder if knight g1. Knight g1 looks lost to rook takes g1. It is, yeah. Just glancing. It's still our fifth best move. Is to not only is it lost, it's checkmate in 21 apparently. So yeah, what can white do? They might push the f pawn, but you can see this is getting out of control now. Where, you know, the pawns are getting away from the king. None of them are defended. Well, the f4 pawn is temporarily, but yeah, you can see this is just getting out of control. Black just simply drops the king back to e4. So yeah, back here, white has got to be careful that things don't get out of hand like that. But they can simply play king f2. If they could also play king g2, by the way, which maintains a defense on that h3 knight. The reason that you might care about that is that one thing that black could try here is h5. But there's a nice little trick here. We don't even need to be defending that knight. We can still just do this. And that's completely drawn. Or whether the king had gone to f2 or g2. If black carries on with king d4, then the knight's got to f4. This is a pretty ideal square for the knight. Attacking this pawn, defending on rook would have to come back, or the pawn comes forward to g5. I'm about to cover that in another variation. And it's just okay. Now, where had I got to? That was all in this line here. rook a4. What if black carries on with king d4? Yeah, and this is very similar lines, but I just want to show what happens if black tries g5. There's something that's nice to look at here. Knight h3, king e3. So it looks bad again, but this time black's not controlling the f4 square, so our knight can hop in. And what if black plays g5 in this position? Well, we can simply take, come back to h3, and we're doing the attacking the enemy pawn, so that's going to tie either the black rook or the black king down to the defense of it. It would have to be the black rook straight away, whilst simultaneously controlling some key invasion squares. Very similar to knight and 1 versus rook and 1. I mean, what does black do? They defend their g5 pawn temporarily, presumably, with rook a5. That's the engine's top move. But then we can just do nothing. We can just move our king back and forth between g2 and g3. If they bring their king back to defend, they can't even. They'd have to do it slowly as well, wouldn't they? Because that e5 square steps in front of the rook's defense. We could probably even nab it then. But even in the long term, we can't stop black setting up defending that pawn. But they're not going to get in with their rook. Sure, they can get their rook back to a2, but we just move our knight somewhere and then move it back again. So it's a very easy defensive setup. I think that was all the lines covered there. And in fact, I think that's all the lines covered with this entire plan. So that's what white should have done. King h3, push the g-pawn, think about where they want their knight. f5 was a good square for it. In some lines, f4 was a good square in other lines. But yeah, it was... unlike what Alekhine thought at the time, this position very defendable. In the game, knight f2 was played. We don't know, because we couldn't possibly claim to know the mind of the player at the time, but we don't know whether they didn't put any thought into it. But it looks like they didn't. It looks like they're just sort of moving their pieces around, waiting to see what black does. And I mean, I might have drawn the wrong conclusion, but my conclusion from going through this stuff is, well, like I've already said, once the dust has sort of settled from a previous part of the game, try to think schematically about where you want your pieces in advance, especially when you've got time to sort of... it's almost like you're setting up ready for an attack. You need to do your preparation whilst you've got that time. Anyway, yeah, knight f2 played in the game. And I mean, it's very unclear what white's achieved there as the black king came in. And yeah, black just sort of slowly improved their position. It's still just drawn, by the way. White hasn't messed anything up here. This wasn't necessarily a bad... it's not really a plan, but this wasn't a bad non-plan. And this is where white goes wrong. Okay, so h5, that's a losing move, apparently. That's a mistake. It's weak, and it was okay in some of those other lines we looked at, because the g-pawn could come forward and defend it. It's actually very hard for white to set that up now. What they should have done instead is just done something like knight f4. And this is just one example line. I struggled to make sense of a lot of these moves, because it looked like black was attempting a triangulation there or something. You can see that white's just moving their knight back and forth, and eventually black gets their act together and comes to after the g-pawn. But we go after black's g-pawn. Rook back to a7, knight back to f4, rook a6, knight h3. And yeah, I mean, Alekhine claimed that this position was won now that black's made contact with the g-pawn. And indeed, if knight h3 is played, black has won. Rook g6 check. Or if instead of knight h3, if white plays h5, this is a weak pawn again, and black can just attack it, and white's slowly going to run out of moves. They can't move their knight now because the h-pawn's attacked. King f2, king h3, rook g5. I mean, what do we do here? If we move the G pawn, the F pawn's gone. We can't move the knight because the H pawn's gone. If King H4, King E3, and you can see that White's position's just fallen apart there. So Alekhine was right if White played H5 or Knight H3, but in fact White can just defend with King H2. Now there's some nice lines coming up here. Yeah, Rook A2. Now this is the when I say some nice lines coming up, when we've got knight and pawn versus rook and pawn or whatever, with this sort of layering of knowledge idea, we should always be on the lookout for, all right, we might lose one of our pawns, but then do we get to a drawn version of something else we know about? White has two drawing moves here, one of which is very counterintuitive, but it just shows how strong White's defensive setup is in a minute. Like, Black's attacking G2, and we are struggling to think, hang on a minute, how do we stop G5 knocking us off the defense of G2? It looks like Black's going to win the G2 pawn, and there's not much we can do to stop it. And indeed, that's true. We're going to move our king, and you wouldn't think to put it on G3, because then the G2 pawn's going to full check, which doesn't seem clever. Surely you'd want to gain an extra move by playing King H3. I don't know why, but the engine's got King G3 as a slightly better move. It just baffles me. I cannot see how I could ever find that move in a million years, because I would want to play King H3, get to basically the same sort of setup we're about to get to, but we've got an extra move because we're not getting checked off G3. But just to sort of point out how strong White's impending defensive setup is, King G3 was also fine. Anyway, here comes the move we're worried about. Now, we're worried about that move because we're losing our G2 pawn. But also, if we think about it in another way, we want that move to happen. A, it swaps some pawns, so we're closer to rook versus knight. And B, we might remember from rook and pawn versus knight and pawn that when the pawns are locked, that's kind of annoying for the side with the rook. They actually want their pawn further back so that they don't have to waste valuable time and resources defending it. So now that G5 pawn is harder to defend than it was back on G7. Black's basically got less space, especially when they get their rook stuck on G2. You could pause the video here if you wanted to, and going back to that idea of like, okay, like the dust has settled, a new position is about to arise. Here we've got a 3-on-2. After this, we're clearly going to have a 1-on-1. The G2 pawn's about to fall. Where do you want your knight? As it happens, you can't really make a bad decision here, but it's still worth thinking about. Where do we want our knight? Like, one obvious square is E6, where it attacks G5. We want our knight to sort of simultaneously attack the enemy pawn whilst also control key squares into our camp. But the best two moves are knight D3 and knight G6, and we're heading for the E5 square. Rook takes G2, knight to E5. And the reason the E5 square is so good is it's sort of temporarily defending F3. This rook's sort of trapped on the G file in front of its own pawn, because Black can't really allow this. It's going to lead very quickly to a drawn version of knight versus rook. If White can get this pawn push in as well as a swap, I mean, you need to be a bit careful how you do it. You've got visions of getting pinned along the fourth rank or something, but this G pawn's so weak that surely Black's in trouble. The main thing that Black might think to do to try and sort of bust this defensive setup is bring their king in. King F2, but here's the trick. That Black king's now got to do two things. It's got to avoid a knight E1 check, forking the king and the rook, and it's got to stay in defense of the rook, because the rook's being attacked by that king on H3. So king F1, and then back to E5. It's just... well, again, not a fortress, but it's just a sort of impenetrable defensive setup. So that was interesting. It's always worth thinking about. You know, we don't have to be hell-bent on defending all of our pawns. At some point, one of our pawns might drop. But in that particular case, it's like, okay, our G2 pawn dropped, but we managed to swap some other pawns and then get... well, we got black into a muddle there, didn't we? There's just no way for black to get out of that. That's just a draw. So yeah, that's what white should have done back here. Knight f4. Instead, they played h5. It is a losing move, and and that pawn is now weak. Rook down to c2. Knight f4 played in the game. If knight f2, it doesn't really do much. King d4. Knight might come to e4. King e3. Knight to d6. Rook c5. King h4. That knight's getting a bit separated from its king. Rook g5. That's just one example line. We can see that black's taken complete control there. So knight f4 played in the game. And now black goes wrong with a perfectly innocent looking move. Okay. Rook d2 is a bad move. What black should have played here is king f5. I'll explain why actually by first of all showing what happened after rook d2, or sorry, what could have happened after rook d2. So after rook d2, white blundered back, if you like, or incorrectly didn't appreciate the urgency of the situation by playing knight h3 back. What white needs to do here is to try and transpose into that drawn configuration that we saw, the drawn position configuration that we saw before. So they can play knight g6 check. If black now plays king f5, it's sort of too late for white achieving their aim of getting the pawn to g4. The king can shift, and we are going to get that defensive setup that we looked at. Even if black hits the f pawn, g4 is coming with check, so then we can get the king back to g3 afterwards. And if king d4, then we're still going to be able to get the same effect. Okay, knight back to h4, rook a2, king f4. There was no check there because the king on d4 was in the way, and g4. And we're going to get the same defensive setup. So that's what white should have done. Instead, they played knight h3. But let's see how king f5, instead of this error, would have stopped all of that. So king f5 is the move that should have been played. And the point is that after king knight g6, not only does that not arrive with check, but the black king's one closer, already a step closer to the h5 pawn. So the knight would have to come back. Rook back to c6, controlling key squares, and that looks like the h-pawn's falling straight away. I can't see how the h-pawn's not falling straight away there. So white might play, instead of knight g6, might play knight h3, and a bit of manoeuvring around. Not all the moves are sort of that hard to understand, and not all the moves are that easy to understand. Sometimes there seems to be a bit of triangulation going on, and sometimes just seems to be a bit of sort of nothing moves going on. But the entire time with that h-pawn we being played, it was a weakness. We could never get our g-pawn to g4 to defend it. So black's moves were sort of all centered around there. In fact, if we just go back, you know, that we're holding the g-pawn down here with the rook on the second rank. So there's never a moment in all of these moves where black is allowing white to get that pawn to g4 and that decent defensive setup. The h-pawn's now gone. I don't think there's anything wrong with rook takes h5. What's the engine saying? It'll be followed by f4. But yeah, how about just knock the knight away from e6 first. The g7 pawn can't be taken, of course, because you'd lose the knight to rook g5 check. Anyway, so I think I've covered all those variations. I think, so yeah, rook d2 played instead of, have I covered everything? Um, King f5 should have been played, wasn't. Rook d2 was played. That should have allowed white to achieve the defensive setup that we keep looking at, that should have been thought about earlier. And instead, white, again, it looks like the play with the white pieces just didn't really sense any urgency and just sort of did nothing. But this pawn's weak, and white's position just sort of gets more and more out of control now. King d4, knight back into f4, king e3. In the game, the knight came to e6, but equally hopeless, I think Dvoretsky calls it. Our knight h3, rook a2, knight back to f4, rook a5. There you go, the h-pawn's weak, and what does white do here? Knight e6, rook e5. I think we've already seen something incredibly similar to that, if not exactly that position. If king g4, rook d4, g3, zugzwang, king moves, f-pawn's gone. So in the game, knight e6, the rook came to d5. White then weakened their position further with f4, but if they try not to, then yeah, we've got rook e5, and then if the g-pawn might fall fine, but rook g5, knight e6, rook takes g2, and we can see that white's sort of in a big mess there. So in the game, f4 was played, rook f5, king g4, rook f6. In the game, white sort of weakened their position even further here with f5, but what else can they do? If knight takes g7, we've got rook takes f4 check, king h3, rook back to f6, and again the knight and the king are getting separated. It's looking very bad, isn't it? I can't see how white's going to save their knight there. The engine's got -5, but it just gets more and more out of control. I mean, if you compare this position here with where we were, I don't know, back in one of those defensive setups that, not that one. See if I can find one of those defensive setups that should have happened earlier on, which I now can't find for some reason. But yeah, that one there. That's fine, isn't it? So if you compare where we got to with something like that, yeah, you can. It's very clear which one you prefer. So we are here, aren't we? Yeah. Rook f5 played, king g4, rook f6, f5. Sorry, that's where we got to. Rook back to f7 to defend the g-pawn, g3, king e4, and there's just nowhere for the white knight to go. Knight c5 check, king d4. The knight's really getting separated from the king here. King back to e5, the f-pawn's falling, and white resigned. So yeah, there were drawing chances there for the side with the knight that had the extra pawn. But I mean, I might be just wrong on this, but it looked like not a lot of effort went into really thinking about where do I want my pieces to sort of preempt the attack. Where are they going to be best placed? And just like knight and one pawn versus rook and one pawn, any line of thinking that has your knight doubling up as controlling key squares into your camp, you know, in a well set up camp with the pawn on g4, whilst also attacking the enemy pawns, is going to give you the best chances. That's as far as I can tell. Right, this is a game from 1985. It ended up in the tragi-comedies section. It looks very easy. I've looked at it a bit, and it seems incredibly simple for black to draw this. There's not really many ways they can go wrong. Again, black should spend some time. It's black to move, by the way. They should spend some time thinking about, right, where do I want my pieces? I spent a long time thinking about it and came up with the same move as the play with the black pieces. And I was thinking, well, it's fine with my pawn on h5, and I could have my knight on f7 controlling some key invasion squares. And I sort of went for that plan. Although, as it turns out, I think Dvoretsky says that that wasn't a very clever move, and you should actually just bring your knight back to g7 to come into f5. But fine, h5 is fine. But I spent ages thinking about where do I want my pieces and what's the defensive configuration here. But it turns out that the black really just doesn't have anything to worry about. And it's sort of quite amusing how it ends up in the tragicomedies section. So h5 played, and this is just drawn at this stage. Knight g5 check, king f4, knight back to e6 check, king e3. White just does a little triangulation to give the move back to black. And knight e6 is supposedly a mistake. It's dubious. And black should have played knight f7. What we want to try and do as black is swap the pawns. We want to get the g5 push in. And it's very clear that that's what the player with the black pieces at the time also wanted to do when they played knight e6. But they had to be careful, because g5 in a minute actually blunders away the draw. So if the knight goes back to f7, king might come into f4, king g7, rook a6, king h7, rook a7, king g7. And, white sort of manoeuvres around and makes a bit of inroads, but there you go. There's the g5 pawn push. King e6, black doesn't have to go for the next, what looks like risky manoeuvre. They can just play king g6. But in fact, because the white king's quite far advanced, black can just give up the knight, and go for a drawn version of rook versus pawn. It's just a draw. In fact, white has to be careful not to lose that. Although not that careful, it's a fairly easy draw. So knight f7 not played, knight e6 played instead. The white king came into e4, and it's fine still. Black can just play knight d8. You might see rook a6 check, king g7. Again, it looks like white's making inroads. Knight f7 check, king e6. Knight back to d8 check. Is that the only drawing move? It is actually the only drawing move now, is to play knight d8 check. King e7. Watch this. This is pretty cool. g5. Bosh. We can't play knight f7 here, because rook a7 wins. The threat is either king e6 or king e8, immediately winning the black knight. What does black do? If they sort of move their king, then the white king's into f6. That's clearly gone. And if instead they move their knight, we'd see a check. King has to go to the back rank. The king's into f6, and it's clearly gone. So knight f7 loses to rook a7, but black just forgets about the knight and plays g5. King takes d8, g takes h4, white king comes back in, h3. I mean, white's got to do something about these pawns. It looks like this is quite a nice way to take control, because that h pawn can't be pushed. Well, it can be, but it would lose. So black needs to get their king into the game and get a drawn version of rook versus pawn that way. So even back at this stage, it was still okay for black to play knight d8. But they wanted their knight on f7, supporting this pawn push to g5, not on e6, and they tried it here, and it throws away the game. Rook f5 check, king g6, king into e5. Black goes for the same kind of idea, g takes h4, so they're just going to sack the knight, but hope that their rook's pawns are going to do the business. Push the h pawn. White has only one winning move here. It's checkmate in 28, but you might want to pause the video and see if you can find it. So we're obviously wandering into the territory of rook versus pawn, but king e5 is the move, and when the h-pawn gets pushed, the rook comes back to f1. And you're thinking, how is this a draw? King g5, rook to h1, round up the h-pawn. Rook takes h2, h-pawn gets pushed. Only one winning move again, which is rook g2 check. What's so good about this? King f3, and then rook off to the side. This doesn't work, this win that we're about to deploy, it doesn't work against a non-rook's pawn. It's an extra little trick go and revisit the rook versus pawn material. Made loads of videos on rook versus pawns and covered this extra little trick that white's got. h3, king f5, again the only winning move there, king f5, king g3, rook a3 check, king g2, king g4, h2, rook a2 check, king g1, and here's the trick, we let black queen, but then it's going to be checkmate on the next move. So, okay, so why doesn't that work against a non-rook's pawn? Well, against a non-rook's pawn, we don't queen, we knight with check. Okay, and then we get a drawn version of rook versus knight if it was a non-rook's pawn. This is not a drawn version because it's a rook's pawn. So it's the only time this winning tactic of just sort of lawn-mowering. It's not a lawn-mower. It's a lawn-mower. It's two rooks, but what is it? Where you just sort of put them down one rank at a time with the king and the rook. The only time it works as a winning method is against a rook's pawn. And quite fitting, of course, that when we're talking about rook versus knight, we end up with a rook versus knight in the final position. I say the final position, we've got one more to go through. This one's pretty cool. This is a study from 1920, a bit of fun really to end this video on. White to play, pause the video, what would you do next? So obvious moves like rook d7, they don't really work. The black knight can come into e6, we attack it, fine, but it can come in, deliver a check, king back to b7. You can see that white's getting nowhere there. That's just drawn, drawn, drawn. So we have to try and be a bit more imaginative. And the idea here is c5. That's the winning move. Well done if you found it. I mean, what if black just takes it, first of all? D takes c5, rook d7, knight e6, rook e7. The difference is that black can't take their own pawn. So their position's just going to fall apart there, and that's going to be a win for white. So great. Is this interesting? Well, it's very interesting actually. It's a really cool study because black doesn't take the pawn. Black plays knight e6, and we only have one winning move here because we're having our rook and our pawn forked. So this c5 move doesn't look good. But check this out. C takes d6. Bosh. That rook's got to be taken. Okay. D takes c7. I made the classic mistake. I found all of these moves, found c5, found this combination, and then went to look at the solutions and realised I'd missed the next bit. These good studies, the ones I enjoy the most, are the ones that are like, oh, there's that other bit as well. How clever! And it is here. I missed this, knight b7. Didn't look one move further. Classic rookie error. You know, we saw in the last position, this video is about rook versus knight. I'll just go back to it. It's rook versus knight. We can't queen in a video on rook versus knight. We've got to knight to get back to rook versus knight. And here, we can't queen, which will be stalemate, in a video on rook versus knight. We've got to rook to get back to rook versus knight. What does black do? There isn't a square for their knight. They're covered directly by the rook. That's covered indirectly by the rook. Rook c6 check picks it up. So the only plausible move is knight takes a5. Come and attack the knight. It can either sort of get away from its... I was about to say it can get away from its king. It can't. It's just that's covered by the king. So yeah, the knight doesn't have a square. These are all covered by the white king and rook. The knight's got to move because it's attacked. I mean, obviously this next move isn't the best one, but it's the only sensible one that doesn't lose the knight. Is knight b7, but that is checkmate. What a brilliant way to end it. So that last position was just a bit of fun. I would say that that game from 1930 is certainly it's the one that I found the hardest of the 4 positions that I've just been through in this video. And well, I've said loads of times already about how I think if I've gained anything from going through all of this, it's when you've got time to set up a defence, think about what your best defence is. Where do you want your pawns? Where do you want your knight? What's going to give the side with the rook the biggest headache?